Okay, so I'm just going to start by telling you a little bit about Wildlands Trust and why we're here tonight. My name is Rachel Calderara. I'm the Outreach and Education Manager at Wildlands Trust. I'm also your meeting host tonight, and in normal times, I would be either a meeting host or a presentation host at our community conservation barn down in our headquarters in South Plymouth, or maybe I'd be on a hike with you or some other kind of program, but as you know, we can't really get together right now, so we are very lucky that we have Zoom, and we're thankful to Wayne for hosting tonight. I wanted to tell you a little bit about who we are as an organization, especially if you are new and you've never come to a Wildlands Trust program before. We are a regional land trust for Southeastern Massachusetts, and our mission is to conserve and permanently protect native habitats, including farmlands and lands of high scenic and ecological value. And we do this in order to keep our communities healthy and our residents connected to the natural world. This is our service area here. There's a little bit of a delay, I think, with the slides, so I'll slow down. We are in over 40 towns across the region of Southeastern Massachusetts, and that covers the 4 counties as well. That's Plymouth County, Barnstable, Norfolk, and I'm missing one. That's okay, I'll come back. And we have about 10,000 acres of land that we protect in this region. So I skipped ahead. Besides protecting that land, we also have to keep it safe and keep it open to the public. So we have a whole department dedicated to the stewardship of our properties. They maintain our trails, they improve habitat for wildlife. We also do education like this. We do community engagement. We work with kids in Brockton, we work with kids in Plymouth, we do lots of youth programs and adult programs as well. And a big part of our work that wouldn't be possible is without the collaboration with our partners. So we work with towns, other nonprofits, state agencies all the time. They're a huge factor in our ability to protect and conserve land in this region. Our members, I know we have some members on the call tonight, and I want to thank you so much. Our members are what make our work possible. There's a lot of really great reasons to either join or renew your membership right now. We're in the middle of our membership drive. So it just starts at $50 a year, and I will send you the link to membership in a follow-up email. I'll also send you a link, by the way, for an evaluation for this program so that you can tell us kind of how it went and we can help, it will help us improve for the future. So right now, we're offering a couple of additional benefits for membership. So you can give a free 1-year membership to a healthcare worker in your life if you join or renew before July 1st. That's our just a little nod to help our healthcare workers get outside and enjoy our properties, which are free and open to the public for everybody, by the way. And right now we have a 1-to-1 matching gift up to $20,000. So anything that you give is going to be matched and your impact is doubled. And that is going to end on June 30th. So I really encourage you to become a member now instead of waiting until later in the year. And of course, 100% of your membership goes right to our work, right to protecting land in your region. So we wouldn't be able to do it without you, and we hope that you join us if you have not become a member already. Okay, so tonight's program is Birds of Spring with Wayne Petersen. It's May 14th, not March 14th. Ignore that. Why are we having this program tonight? Well, we have a lot of reasons to have this program. One, Wayne is a fabulous presenter, and I'm sure if you're on this call, you already know that. But it connects directly to our work at Wildlands Trust. So birds rely on the habitat that Wildlands provides. Bird watching is a great activity. It's really fun, no matter how old you are. It's something that you can do right now. You can do it from your backyard, out your window. All of our Wildlands Trust preserves have remained open during this pandemic, so you can go bird watching at Wildlands Trust properties and other conservation lands in your area. And right now, because it's spring, we have lots of migrants coming through, so this is very relevant to the times. So tonight's presenter is Wayne Petersen. He is the Director of Important Bird Areas Program at Mass Audubon. He's also on the Board of Directors at Wildlands Trust, and he has been leading programs for us and across the globe for many, many years. He is a renowned ornithologist, and we're very, very lucky to have him tonight. His talk is going to cover migration behaviors and patterns also some current research, and of course, local bird species to look for during the spring. So I'm going to stop. That's the end of my presentation. If anybody has any questions right now, I see there's a couple of questions in the chat. You're welcome for keeping our trails open. Yes, that was a big decision, and we've seen a lot of increased foot traffic. Again, another reason your membership would mean so much to us right now. We have been working around the clock. Our stewardship crew, we've brought new people on. We've been working really, really hard to keep those preserves safe. So thank you for recognizing that. Any other questions? We can do the hand raise feature or the chat. And if not, I'm going to turn it over to Wayne. Yeah, it doesn't look like there's how old is our organization? We were founded in 1973, right in Plymouth. And since then we expanded to the region of Southeastern Massachusetts. So almost 50 years old. All right. Wayne, I think it's time for you to start sharing your screen so we can see what we came here to see tonight.
First of all, Rachel, I want to thank you for all the energy that you've put into not only assisting the mechanics of this thing, but you know, the preparation and the advertising and so forth and so on. It's always a treat to have a chance to speak to people down at the Wildlands Trust, because there's always a fun and enthusiastic crowd of people who share a lot of the same things that I do in terms of interests and whatever. So this is really a pleasure. And I have to say, even though it grieves me to say it, that I think we're gradually inching toward what may become the new normal in terms of how a lot of presentations and workshops and all sorts of things happen these days. It seems that this is increasingly something that people are doing, whether it's just because of the pandemic or who knows. But in any case, here we are. So with that in mind, I would echo what Rachel said. If you have questions, you can interrupt. She'll be able to intercept the questions. And if there are things that seem like I really should answer them right then, I'm happy to do that. Otherwise, if you stockpile them until we sort of take a break, that's another way to do it. But a lot of times questions kind of get forgotten or lost in the shuffle if you wait too long. So whatever people are most comfortable with works for me. As I reminded Rachel the other day, in another life, I was a middle school teacher for 18 years. So accordingly, not only have I fulfilled my debt to society, but also I'm very familiar with all manner of distractions and interruptions and whatever may come along. So don't be concerned about having to interrupt or ask questions or just whatever. Okay? So birds of spring. And as the title that I suggested here, a presentation for the Wildlands Trust, I was going to use the word overview, but then I said, that's kind of silly, an overview for the Wildlands Trust. But in fact, this is going to be a bit of an overview. I am going to divide this presentation into kind of two parts, one of which will be somewhat generic as it relates to bird migration and birds on a sort of a holistic level. And then I'm going to sort of move into what I'm calling a calendar of spring and sort of just talk about representative bird species that are arriving and have been arriving now for, you know, a month or more as the pageantry of migration begins to unfold, which is near its peak for the spring migration, you know, right now. You know, the next week, 10 days, the last week or 10 days. May is arguably one of the most exciting months of the year for people who are interested in birds, at least in the springtime, because especially since so many of the birds are in their brightest plumages and colors and things, because they're headed for their breeding grounds. Whereas in the fall, there may be more individual birds around because of all the young of the season, but most of them are not as colorful and arguably even as distinctive in terms of their appearance. So hold on to that. Just by way of introduction, the two birds that are on the screen here, I suspect a lot of you probably recognize, well, maybe you recognize both of them, but the one in the upper right-hand corner is an eastern bluebird, which for a lot of people I think is a real hallmark of spring. And then the one down in the lower left is what is now called a yellow-rumped warbler, but when I was a much younger person, and arguably a lot of you were too, you may have learned it as a myrtle warbler. And that's another story, but we won't get into that right now, okay? So, a little look back here. Remember when we used to go birding together, sometimes closer than 6 feet apart. We also look forward to Birdathon. For those of you who don't know about Mass Audubon's Birdathon, it starts at 6 p.m. tomorrow evening and ends at 6 p.m. on Saturday evening. Birdathon is an annual event in the organization that I work for. It's also the largest fundraiser event of the year, the most important fundraiser of the year at Audubon. And this year, because of the pandemic, there have been some significant modifications in the way it's conducted, but suffice to say, it's happening, and it seems that the enthusiasm and the turnout is actually as great almost as we've ever had. So it's a go figure. Another thing about spring is that it was traditionally a season for lovers. Lots of people planned weddings and all sorts of romantic things associated with proms and this, that, and the other thing. So there is this kind of legacy piece to what goes along with this time of the year, depending upon your perspective and what you're interested in. But the good news is that, fortunately, despite the pandemic, every year, literally millions of feathered travelers still make their way northward and southward spring and fall during migration. That's one of the great miracles, I think, of life, is the tremendous movement of birds over the course of the continents and through the hill and dale. This is a map that some of you may recognize. This was from the National Geographic magazine some years ago now, but it rather graphically depicts the Western Hemisphere with all of the attendant arrows and so forth, indicating various routes of migration that different species take. In some cases, they sort of go back and forth following the same route spring and fall, but in some other cases, they have different routes in the spring from what they follow in the fall. So we'll talk a little bit about that as we go forward. But I think this picture with all the different species of birds that are located on it there does give you some sense not only of the diversity of bird life on the planet. It's a moving target in terms of how many birds there are, but the sort of round figure that people are using most of these days is about 10,000 species of birds. So that gives you some frame of reference. Massachusetts, little old Massachusetts, has recorded just about 501 or 2 species of birds, total different kinds that have ever been recorded here. There's about 200 plus that breed with varying degrees of regularity and frequency. And for somebody who really knows their business and really wants to travel around the state during a year, it's possible to see over 300 species in a year. But once you start pushing that envelope, you begin to get up to the point where you really have to hustle, and you kind of have to know what you're doing. But just a few little benchmarks for what we're talking about here. So when we're talking about these vast movements of birds, this may seem like, whoa, what is this? This is like a reminder of winter. Well, these are snow geese in the background in flight, and there's sandhill cranes in the foreground, and there's blackbirds and some crows in the picture as well. But the bottom line is that we don't very often see numbers of any of these species for certain in Massachusetts approaching this. But to make the case that these tremendous movements of birds, in many cases across the continent or from one continent to the other, often involve literally millions of individuals, especially when you start talking about small birds, warblers, sparrows, tanagers, buntings, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that in addition to waterfowl, of which there's all kinds of species of waterfowl, there are raptors, and there are some people who are avid raptorophiles who are willing to sit out on the tops of mountaintops for days at a time, spring and fall, staring at white tablecloth with peppercorns in the sky, because certain species of hawks, like these broadwing hawks, often gather in huge, what are called kettles, under the right conditions and in the right places where they concentrate. And I'm sure that some of the more avid amongst you have picked out the outlier here. There is one outlier in this picture, and I'll let you guys find it and figure out what it is. But in any case, this is a view that one could sometimes see in sort of the first couple of weeks in September, in the fall, if you were very fortunate. Not so much in our part of the country in the spring, but there are places in the country where these kinds of numbers can be seen spring and fall during the migration either north or south. And most of these broadwing hawks will winter in South America. A lot of them will go to Peru. Shorebirds, huge numbers of shorebirds pass up and down, particularly the coast, but also inland. And here again, in Massachusetts, we're favored with some terrific shorebird habitat. So there's lots of places where in season, it's possible to see lots of shorebirds. These happen to be short-billed dowitchers. And finally, the ones that everybody is waiting for at this time of the year are the warblers. And they are certainly the gems and the jewels of the bird world, at least in the North America. If you lived in Europe or Asia, the old world warblers, for those of you that know what warbling vireos look like, most of them look like warbling vireos. They're very, very colorless. They're sort of gray and olivey, and they don't have a lot of distinctive markings, and they're certainly not colorful. So in the spring particularly, it's often, at some of our more popular birdwatching spots, you'll often run into a lot of Europeans and others from other parts of the world that have come to see our North American wood warblers, because this is a family of birds that's unique to our part of the world. The warblers, the birds that are called warblers in other parts of the world are not that closely related to our warblers. But again, just to give you the cast of characters here, the black-throated green warbler in the upper left-hand corner, the chestnut-sided warbler underneath, the magnolia warbler in the upper right-hand corner, and a Nashville warbler underneath. And I should say now, and I'll say it at the very end, the vast majority of pictures that you're seeing are not mine. Some of them are, but the majority of them, in fact, are from a very well-known and highly published bird photographer from California, Brian Small, who did the illustrations, or I should say the photographs, for a book that I worked on, and has very generously let me use a lot of his pictures for some of these kinds of programs. But that's what those things are in any case.
Hey, Wayne, would you mind if I asked a question?
No.
All right. Claire wants to know, what was the outlier? I think that was in relation to the last slide.
Oh, yeah, I didn't really, I didn't want to get into that. Let me see. I think I can back this up. Do you want me to tell you what it was or where it is? Or both? Well, I won't say this. This is where it is. Can you see my cursor?
Yes.
That's the outlier.
Yes, but yeah, I picked that one out. Thank you.
All right, and what it is a Swainson's hawk.
Oh, I didn't ID it right. Thank you.
It's all right. You did well to find it.
Okay, that's the only question that's come up. Thank you, Claire.
Indeed. So one of the first questions that inevitably comes up when we think about seasonality and birds migrating seasonally and so forth is, why do they do it? Well, a lot of the answer is sort of ultimately, if you want to trace it, put a real fine point on it, it's all about food and resources. because food is one of the most essential things that governs a lot of the behavior of lots of animals throughout the year and throughout their lives. So the effort to reduce intraspecific competition for resources, and resources, for the moment, I'm thinking primarily of food, but that could include other aspects of habitat as well, particularly in the face of climate change over long spans of time, glacial and interglacial periods. You know, everybody is, you know, climate change is on everybody's lips these days, and for good reason. But I think it's just important to pinch yourself and remember that climate has always changed and been changeable, and that there have been, if we use a long measuring stick, periods when we had ice a mile thick over where we're all sitting right now. But between times, we had conditions in some situations that were practically tropical. So the glacial and interglacial periods are one of the things that over the long stretch of time have in fact molded and formed and ultimately mandated, if you will, migration as an activity. So retreating from seasonal temperature changes is obviously locked into the phenomenon that I just described. But the interesting thing is today, what we see recapitulated every year is the equivalent of a glacial and interglacial period, so that many bird species that breed in the northern hemisphere, particularly those that breed farther north than the US border, Canada and on up into the Arctic, you know, they're essentially having to deal with near glacial conditions much of the year. And at the same time, as those of us who live in this part of the world realize, in some winters it's really very cold and may feel glacial to us, but then eventually it warms up and we have days like today and months like the months that are optimistically ahead of us here, so that we have this big swing in what the seasonal temperatures average out to be, which is in many ways, if you want to think of it as a microcosm of what was over much longer spans of time, when we had glacial conditions and then we had much warmer interglacial periods. So there's this recapitulation of what was on an annual basis. And a lot of it is driven by seasonal temperature changes, which then affects the food supply, which is ultimately the third bullet here, to exploit food resources that are only seasonally available. That is to say, since so many bird species rely on insects and arthropods and other invertebrate organisms, these guys are somewhat affected by what happens to those food items during the times of the year when they either die and some other life stage of their life cycle is what gets them through the winter, or they hibernate and they disappear and they're not available. So for all of the insect-eating species, of which there is a plethora, you know, things like flycatchers and swallows, most warblers, and a great many other birds, they're sort of faced with a significant challenge every year when those sorts of food supplies become scarce or unavailable. And one of the biggest ways in which over time they have dealt with this is they migrate. They evacuate their summer homes where arthropods and insects and things are abundant, and then they move into areas that are either in the southern part of the United States, or they move down into Mexico and the Caribbean or South America. And those birds that do that are the ones that are sort of collectively described as neotropical migrants. The neotropics are the New World tropics. So once we get south of northern Mexico, we begin to get into a different sort of realm of plants and other animals and so forth and so on. And those are the New World tropics. And that's where a lot of these birds that are here only in the summer, or that are returning to us now to take advantage of what will become, you know, all the kinds of things that are pesky for us in the summertime, you know, the mosquitoes at your cookout and ticks in the grass and so forth and so on. They're coming into their season now, but the birds are coming to harvest them and take advantage of them. So I think if you think about the whys birds migrate from a big picture point of view, these three bullets, in effect, give you the most important things that you need to know, and which is not to say there aren't other factors. Because there are some species, for example, that don't migrate at all. Things like the great horned owl and the cardinal are essentially sedentary. And there are birds that eat insects in the summer, like cardinals, robins that feed on earthworms and insects in the summertime. They don't have to go to the tropics the way lots of neotropical migrants do. That's because one of the other options that's a possibility for a lot of birds is they can alter their diet. That is to say, they can feed on fruits and berries and things of that sort, so that by switching their diet, we have huge numbers of robins in some winters, thousands of robins winter in Massachusetts. A lot of people don't even realize that, but yeah, you know, and they get all excited if they see robins, a flock of robins in their crabapple tree in January or February. Those robins have probably been here much of the winter. They've been feeding on wild berries that are in swamps and thickets and things and just sort of not staying out of human sight. But they haven't gone to Peru or the Amazon or Venezuela or Costa Rica or Mexico. Birds like great horned owls, on the other hand, because they feed mainly on mammals, most mammals, especially the mammals that are the size that great horned owls prefer, things like squirrels, for example, they're active all winter long. They don't have to migrate for the most part. They can get their food here. They can get voles, they can get mice. They'll take their share of birds if they can catch them and so on. So there are some species that don't migrate at all, and that's how they deal with the whole need for other species to migrate. Then there are some species that kind of offer compromise. These are what we call the partial migrants. Things like the blue jay and our state bird, the black-capped chickadee. These are birds where much of the population is sedentary, doesn't move around much at all. But as you go north, latitude-wise, as the weather begins to get more and more severe in the wintertime, in Canada and the northern plain states and all, a lot of those birds take a more conservative approach and try not to stick it out. So they'll begin to drift south. They may actually overfly some of the sedentary populations in something called leapfrog migration. And then come spring, they move north again back into their territory. The point being that here in Massachusetts, typically we have a lot more blue jays and black-capped chickadees here in the winter than we do in the weeks and months ahead. And that's because our population is augmented by these partially migratory jays and chickadees from farther north. And the migrations are not necessarily predictable. Some years there are many more of one or another of these, and there's a whole series of other birds that are even more erratic than this in the wintertime. Blue jays, for example, are sort of triggering, they're keying in on acorns. So in years when we have lots of acorns and a big, what's called a massed crop, a lot of blue jays will shortstop and they'll spend the winter in Massachusetts and southern New England. Otherwise, they may get down into Maryland and the central southern states. Chickadees, same way. Some years we get big eruptions of chickadees, and places like Manomet that bans them and has been banning them steadily since 1969. Big fluctuations in the years of chickadee years and non-chickadee years. And that's based on variations in food supply to the north, where the chickadees are coming from in seasons when they move south. So during the next couple of weeks, keep an eye on the sky, because you may very well see migratory blue jays. Most small birds migrate at night. Blue jays happen to be a diurnal migrant, and a lot of times on the right days when you got south winds and all, you'll see flocks of jays, anywhere from 5 or a dozen, sometimes 20 or 30, moving sort of low over the treetops and across open areas, and then into the next patch of woods and so forth. So they're actually migrating by day. So that's a reminder that they are in fact migratory to some degree. And then there are the real long distance migrants. This is the bobolink. This happens to be a real champion. This is, of all our passerines, this one is about the longest distance migrant that we have in the Western Hemisphere. And if you look at this map, you'll see that the coloration in brown is the breeding range of the bobolink, goes all the way from a little bit south of New England out into Western Canada. The orange is the area through which they migrate on their way to their wintering grounds in Patagonia and Bolivia and Uruguay and places in central southern South America. So that's a long haul, and they change their plumage, and to a certain extent they change their diet because they're mainly insect eating in the summer, but they become granivores, feeding on grains of various sorts during migration in the winter. In fact, in the southeastern United States, bobolinks in the fall are referred to as rice birds because they get into the rice fields there and they eat grain. So they're not the farmer's favorite friend once they leave the United States, even though there's a lot of effort to protect bobolinks here in the States because their populations are declining. And then the champions, the real marathoners, are a lot of the seabirds, things like the Arctic tern and the Wilson's storm petrel. These are birds that literally go all the way to areas like South Georgia and Antarctica for the winter. They literally are going from one hemisphere to the other. In fact, it's often said that the Arctic tern probably sees more hours of daylight than any other living organism because they literally, a lot of them breed north of the Arctic Circle, where they're dealing with pretty much 24 hours of daylight for the period that they're there. Then when they move down into the southern hemisphere during the austral summer, which is our winter, they're getting nearly 24 hours of daylight. So that 20,000 miles that they're doing back and forth, if you are interested in gathering frequent flyer miles, I would say the Arctic tern might be the quintessential bird to hook your star to, because they travel a lot of miles, but they see a lot of hours of daylight as well. And the little storm petrel is about the size of a purple martin, and it breeds in talus slopes, these big tumbled rocky slopes that are on some of the Antarctic mountains and places like South Georgia, and they nestle down into the rocks. That's where they nest. But then they come north, cross the equator the same way the Arctic tern does, and they spend the winter, their winter, the austral winter, with us on the offshore fishing bank. So if you go out on a whale watch in the summer to Stellwagen Bank, you might see these little, what they're often nicknamed Mother Carey's chickens, dancing over the water, picking at plankton. Remember, they're going to make a very, very long trip to get home to nest. One of the things that's always surprising to people who are not too familiar with what a lot of birds do is to learn that the great majority of species migrate at night. And there are good reasons for that. The conditions at night generally are a little less turbid in many cases. There's less concern about predation for small birds that would have to, be concerned with all manners of predators during the daytime. And they can't forage at night. So in terms of their time budget, they've got to figure out a way, if they've got a long migration that's going to take them out of the country, we got to eat, we got to sleep, we got to rest, we got to do whatever we got to do. So it turns out that a great many migratory birds travel at night. And there are good reasons for that. And there are some things that inevitably come to mind when you think about that, not the least of which is, how do they find their way? How does a little bird that's born in a Canadian spruce forest know that it's supposed to go to Nicaragua for the winter, or Colombia, or someplace in Venezuela or whatever? Well, it turns out that there are a number of things that they collectively use to help them navigate and to get them started. But the first of which is something that they're inherited with. They inherit a genetic piece, which is really quite critical to their ultimate survival. And that includes a compass and a map. They have to know a direction they're supposed to go, and they have to have a generalized sense of how they're going to find their way. In some cases, birds like geese, for example, and some waterfowl, they travel with the adults. So the adults that have been there and so to essentially know the way, that's one of the ways that they can get there. But ultimately, it turns out that the stars and the sun are two really important navigational aids that these birds utilize to get them from one spot over the globe to another. They often will follow leading lines like coastlines, mountain ranges, things of this sort. We know from some early research that was done with pigeons that lots of birds and other organisms, in fact, have magnetite in their brain, so that it's felt that these birds that have this stuff can literally take advantage of the Earth's magnetic fields and take advantage of the geography that that provides. And then for seabirds, odors are also something that are very important because odors travel well through and over water. So for some of these birds that don't have the benefit of a lot of landmarks, the way a lot of these pelagic birds do, they're taking advantage of odors that probably they are picking up because they, unlike many birds, do have a keen ability to smell, something that many other land birds don't have. So celestial cues are really important to them. And then things like, you know, the coastline here on the Atlantic coast, for example, or the Appalachians. These are main leading lines that are going in the direction that these guys want to go anyway on a seasonal basis, whether it's in the fall or in the spring on their way back to their breeding grounds. So what initiates migration? How do they know when it's time to start thinking about traveling these tremendous distances? Well, there are internal changes, glandular changes. The hypothalamus, for example, has the impact of increasing hunger, food intake, and fat deposition. These are all essential if you're going to be a long distance migrant. You're going to have take on a lot of food. You're going to have to be able to put on body fat. And as we've seen already, in some cases, you may have to figure out, okay, I got to start eating things other than the protein that I was eating in the summer in forms of arthropods to get my kids out of the nest. Now I got to thinking about eating things with lots of fats and lipids that are going to give me the energy I need to make these long flights. Changes in day length and the position of the sun in the sky. These trigger some of the hormonal changes that are tied up with the internal goings on in a bird that give it the impetus to get ready to go. And then there are things on an immediate basis that are somewhat proximal that affect when they're going to go. Are they going to go tonight? Are they going to go tomorrow? Or should they have gone last night? So changes in temperature, changes in barometric pressure, wind direction, these are all things that can initiate active migration. So at this time of the year, days like today and tomorrow, when we're supposed to have, you know, a pretty good southerly flow, perfect migration conditions for a lot of small nocturnal migrants coming up from the tropics that have been sort of stopping and starting along the way. They're waiting for that big break so that then they can ultimately make a much longer flight than maybe they've been making up to now and moving a lot less leisurely than they were. We know from radar and other studies that a lot of songbirds are generally flying a lot lower than water birds, usually lower than 3,000 feet. The typical night flight for a bird the size of a sparrow or a warbler might be 20 to 50 miles overnight at that, and a rate of speed about that as well. When you start talking about shorebirds and birds of prey and some waterfowl, they go much higher. These are bar-headed geese on the right. Bar-headed geese regularly fly over Mount Everest in migration in Asia. A lot of shorebirds are known to regularly travel at 15 to 20,000 feet during their migration. And obviously they're going long distances nonstop. So these are just a few factoids, I think, to make it clear that in fact there's a lot going on with these birds that may not be obvious to us. The routes that they follow are not the same. I don't know if you can read this, but some of these are north-south routes. Some of them are routes that are only followed at one season or another. And I'll give you some examples in a moment. But clearly, since so many birds are going to Central America and South America for the winter, they've got to get around the Gulf of Mexico. And some of them go right across. That's about a 500 to 600 mile nonstop flight. Others go around and take a more conservative route. And then there are some species that go right down the coast through Peninsula Florida. And they're the ones that in most cases spend the winter in the Caribbean, in the West Indies. So if we talk a typical Atlantic coastal route, bird like the Cape May warbler, Cape Mays are ones that go down through Florida. Cape Mays are pretty common in the fall in Florida and in the spring, even though we think of them as quite uncommon here. There's a lot of them winter in Cuba and Hispaniola, the Dominican Republic, Jamaica. So they have a route that for them is pretty much back and forth. That's what they do spring and fall. The bay-breasted warbler, on the other hand, is one that's one of these trans-Gulf migrants. They go across the Gulf, or in some cases, the wimpy ones go around the Gulf. So you don't see a lot of bay-breasted warblers in Florida, for example, but Cape Mays, on the other hand, you see a lot. And then the blackpoll warbler, which is one of the most aggressive of all, in the spring, we see them coming up through Florida and up the Atlantic coast, and then they fan out because some blackpoll warblers breed as far west as Alaska and as far north as Alaska, and they breed as far east as Labrador. So they fan out over much of Canada and the northern tier of the highest mountains in the eastern United States. But in the fall, they have a very different route. Most of the blackpoll warblers migrate out over the Atlantic Ocean. They fly over Bermuda, and they make a nonstop flight all the way down to the Lesser Antilles, and then they island hop until they get into northern South America, where a lot of the blackpolls spend the winter. So lots of different routes followed by different species, and it's fascinating when you think about, all these comings and goings and how we know what they do. Well, banding has been one of the things that's told us a lot about this over time. That involves color banding and just putting aluminum bands with numbers, and hopefully you'll catch the bird again at a different point. So that's been going on for a long time. Audubon first put colored thread on the legs of his phoebes that were nesting near where he was living to see if they'd come back the next year, and they did. So John James Audubon arguably was one of the first people to sort of experiment with bird banding. But increasingly now we have other techniques that are very useful in terms of giving us a sense of what migrating birds do, when they do it, under what conditions, and so on. And radar has been one of the things that's been very useful. This is a radar image, a photograph of spring migration as birds are coming from Cuba, where huge numbers of birds spend the winter, arriving at Key West in Florida. And from the Keys, they'll move up the Keys, or they'll fly across the Gulf of Florida there to the mainland and gradually work their way up to the Florida Peninsula until eventually they get to New England. But radar tells us what nights and under what conditions they're moving, how high they're flying, how fast they're going. And so there's a lot of technology now that was not available not all that many years ago. And in the case of things like satellite tracking, it's possible to follow birds in real time. This is an osprey with a radio satellite transmitter on it. And these various colored lines here show 3 different ospreys that have followed their way from New England, where they were banded, all the way down into areas in northern South America where they spent the winter. And you can see a lot of them, they cross the eastern end of Cuba, they cross through the Dominican Republic before they then get into South America. But there's a lot of open water for the real pioneers. Others take a more conservative route and get down through Florida. So these are some of the techniques that are telling us how and what these birds are doing. But needless to say, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to know that there's a lot of hazards along the way. And these include everything from cell towers and wind turbines to tall lighted buildings, glass of all sorts, food-related issues, predators, storms, hurricanes, and then just plain navigational error that may be due to some sort of a genetic misfiring or whatever. So there's all kinds of things that can interfere with migration and makes it a very hazardous way to survive if you have to do it multiple times in your lifetime, back and forth, north and south. This is what presumably a city looks like at night to a migratory bird. And that's a daunting piece of real estate, given the fact that there's all this lighted glass. If the overcast is low, or if they get caught in foggy weather or light rain, they get mesmerized by the lighted structures. They fly into the glass, or they'll fly into the ground. And that can be devastating. And then there are the predators, the camp followers, things that follow human activity. That includes cats, which obviously are a major predator on birds, which is why everybody is encouraged to please keep your cats indoors. But also, there are things like skunks and possums and foxes and coyotes and all sorts of things that are associated with human activity. Those are also predators on birds, whether they be birds that are nesting or whether they be birds that they can catch in other respects. And this doesn't even speak to things like merlins and peregrine falcons and Cooper's hawks and sharp-shinned hawks and things. So it's a hazardous process, this migration, and it's a wonder that any of the birds essentially survive. All right, I'm running a little behind here. It's 7:57, and I know that we were supposed to finish at 8, which clearly we're not going to be able to do. But the nice thing is, from your point of view, you can get up and go to the bathroom or go get a beer or heat up some pizza or do whatever you want to do, and I'll never even know. So I suggest, as Rachel had proposed, that we take a break for a few minutes here, and then I'll move more quickly through the last part of this because it doesn't really require as much explanation. How does that sound? Rachel, does that work for you if you're listening?
I am listening, and that's great. And we actually advertised an 8:30 end time. So
oh, that's great.
Doing
well,
great.
I dodged a bullet then.
I have a couple questions in the chat. And also, if anybody wants to use that hand raise icon, I can see a few now.
Is there anything that I can do to facilitate this here?
No, I think I got it. If that's okay with you, Wayne.
Okay.
You ready to answer some questions?
Yeah, sure. No, that's fine. And you're right. You know, I actually did, I don't know, for some reason or other, I think I had a brain cramp. And I was looking at my watch. I said, oh, man, you're right. It is 8:30. And I did know that. And that much more in keeping with the schedule that I made for myself here.
Yeah, how did I fall so far behind? No, you're doing great. Thank you so much. I have a question in the chat here. It says, from Lois, so much energy is required to migrate. What is the difference in lifespan between birds that do and those that stay in place?
Well, that's a good question. And I think the answer may not be intuitive. Some of the longest distance migrants are large birds. And not surprisingly, a lot of large birds live longer than small birds. So, you know, a bird like a duck or a herring gull, you know, they're going to live 10, 12 years and many more. I know there's the herring gull, there's I think a 50-year-old herring gull. That would be at the extreme, but, you know, 20 years or more. Terns, common terns, for example, will live into their late teens and so forth, and they're going to make a lot of trips to the waters off Brazil and South America every winter and so forth and so on. Hummingbirds, tiny little things, you know, ruby-throated hummingbirds about the size of your little finger. These are trans-Gulf of Mexico migrants. They're going 500 to 600 miles nonstop twice a year, spring and fall, across the Gulf. They're not taking a conservative route at all, and most of them are wintering in you know, Costa Rica, Guatemala, Nicaragua, that part of the world, with lots of small songbirds that winter in places like Belize and so forth. So I'm not sure I'm answering the question, but essentially, large birds do live longer than small birds. That's a given. And in terms of how that translates to their the distances that they migrate, there's a correlation there too. In other words, a lot of the bigger seabirds make tremendous journeys, either trans-hemispheric, crossing the equator and coming up either in the Pacific Ocean or the Atlantic Ocean to areas off North America, and then returning to remote islands in either the Pacific or the South Atlantic, or in some cases even as far as Antarctica. So there's that piece to it as well. Did I answer the question? I'm not sure that I really did. I want to make sure that I got the essence of what you were asking.
I think it sounds like it kind of depends. So the question was, do migrating birds live shorter than birds that don't migrate? But it sounds like it just kind of depends on the species, and there's more factors at play.
It does. I mean, we've got birds like a lot of owls that hardly migrate at all. Great horned owl, screech owls, those are pretty good sized birds, and yet they really don't move around very much at all. And then you got all these little warblers and things that aren't, they're only about 5 or 6 inches long, and a lot of those are leaving the country for the winter. So it's really a combination of factors that comes into play to answer that question, or to be detailed in the explanation.
Yeah. All right, we have a hand up here from somebody whose account name is Security. So I'm going to unmute you, and then you went to the bottom of my screen. I'm going to attempt to unmute you so you can ask your question. Here you are. Security, you are ready to go to ask your question. Maybe not. Nope, okay. Put that back on mute. We have some more questions in the chat here from Michael. How do austral migrants different from northern migrants, other than the direction they migrate?
Well, one thing that is a fairly significant difference is there are far fewer austral migrants that are making anything even approaching the distance, or in many cases aren't even moving around as much as northern hemisphere species. So that one of the distinctions is that, and I think the question rightly framed the fact austral migrants are typically migrating from south to north as opposed from north to south. So that would be one difference. But in point of fact, the number of bird species that migrate within South America compared to the number of bird species that migrate within North America, that never leave the country but still move from northern latitudes south, or in some cases they may even move east and west. The numbers are much greater in the northern latitudes. And the reason, in part, for that is in terms of the geologic history of the Earth and where glaciation was most pronounced, and the fact that also there are much larger land masses in the northern hemisphere. One of the interesting things from the point of view of competition, particularly in the winter in Central America, which is kind of right on the bullseye of where the greatest majority of a lot of the small songbirds spend the winter from North America, is that if you look at the land mass of sort of southern Mexico down to Panama, compared to the land masses to the north, South America itself is shaped like an ice cream cone. So that everything that is in the north is considerably confined as it begins to move south. It's like Cape Cod, after 4th of July weekend. The people that live on the Cape, suddenly they're overrun by all the tourists that are coming just for the summer or on vacations and so forth. And it's all you can do to get to the grocery store or get to the beach in the summer because of all these off-Cape migrants. The same is true in a lot of these Latin American countries where there's a lot less land mass, there are lots of people, there's a continuing amount of habitat destruction or disruption, so that a lot of the declines that we're seeing in North American migratory birds that winter south of the border, one of the bottlenecks for them in many cases is what's happening to the land mass and the habitat that's available for them. But in South America, the species that are occupying the Amazon basin or living in the Andes in many cases, they don't really need to migrate very much because there's a much more stable climatic factor there, and food is available more consistently throughout the year. The seasonality is driven more by rain and dry seasons. You know, a lot of tropical birds breed during the rainy season, and then in the rest of the year, they do what our birds do, kind of in the winter. In effect, they don't have to be as concerned about survival because they can get it in various ways. Does that answer the question? I'm not sure, but
Yeah, you're doing great.
bottom line is, though, to give you a graphic example of this, a great majority of the North American shorebird species winter in South America, okay? There, to my knowledge, has never been any record of any North American shorebird ever breeding in South America. You might say, well, why don't they just stay down in Patagonia for the winter and nest there? Well, the answer is quite simple. The climate is not to their advantage during this time of the year when the invertebrates that they feed on are available, and they are very specialized in terms of their diet and the kinds of places they can forage, so that a year-round opportunity just doesn't exist in South America. So they have, over time, their migration has gone from areas of superabundance in the north, on the tundra where there's bazillions of insects, and at the stopover locations where there's lots of invertebrates in the mudflats and so forth and so on, to get them down to South America, where when they get there, it's at a season when the food that they're looking for is available. But if they were to stay there through our summer, things would run out the same way they do in our mudflats and so forth during our winter. And because of the difference in the actual extent of the geography, again, all I got to do is look at a map of Canada and the United States compared to South America and Central America. There's a lot more real estate up here than there is down there. Okay?
All right. Let's see. It is 8:07, so why don't we save the other questions in the chat for the end?
Works for me.
And yeah, I was going to say, Wayne, you might need a little break.
No, I have a lemonade here. I'm good. Thank you.
Okay, great.
So sort of taking a different tact here, everything that I've been talking about has been very sort of generic and talking about big themes in terms of migration and so on. Now I want to bring it a little closer to home and think about the cast of characters as it begins to unfold here, close by. So the first returning migrants of spring, I think most people who are aware of birds and conscious of different species and so forth would argue that, yeah, red-winged blackbird and common grackle, these are two of our real early migrants, first ones back, and we see them sitting around the tops of trees when they first get here, and the redwings are starting to spread out in their conqueree calls, and grackles, the squeaky gates, you're hearing them, and they'll mix in flocks, often with brown-headed cowbirds and so on. So I would say that at our latitude, probably the most conspicuous of the real early spring migrants to come back are blackbirds. And there's a reason for this in part, and that is these are short distance migrants. These are not neotropical migrants. They're not going anywhere nearly as far as a blackpoll warbler or a Cape May warbler or any number of other small birds that breed in the boreal forests up north. These guys spend the winter, most of them in the southeastern United States, in huge numbers, massive numbers, roosts of, in some cases, several million individuals, often mixed, cowbirds, redwings, grackles, starlings in some cases. So the point is they don't have as far to go, and their diet is such that they can get what they need earlier than a lot of the insectivores. So they are often the first ones back in the spring. The first nesters out of the gate, this is an interesting sort of duo here. This is what I would call kind of a dynamic duo, because these two birds have a very definite relationship to one another. First, they occupy similar habitats. They like big timber, and they like a mixture of open areas along with heavily forested area nearby. Great horned owls, and actually very few owls, build their own nests. They are dependent upon other species or other sort of topographical features for providing them with places that are adequate for nesting. Hawks, on the other hand, for the most part, build their own nest, or they occupy a circumstance that's already been in place, like American kestrels nest in tree holes and cavities. Red-tailed hawks are a big bird. They're fairly close to the size of a great horned owl, and they build their own nests. And at the end of the season, in many cases, their nests are significantly substantial, that they're still pretty much intact and so on. So that the great horned owl, which is one of our very earliest breeders, very often will overtake an existing previous year's red-tailed hawk nest. And once a great horned owl has decided that it likes an old red-tailed hawk nest, or maybe an old great blue heron nest, or maybe an old osprey nest, very little can displace great horned owls. So possession is 90%. Even if you built it, the next year you're out of luck if a great horned owl decides that they like it. So this is an interesting case where both of these birds are early nesters. The horned owl usually beats the great horned owl out of the barn. And if they decide that a previous year's great horned red-tailed nest, if the birds come back and want to use it again and there's an owl already in it, nah, sorry guys, you keep it, we'll build another nest. So that's an interesting relationship between these two, but they are among our earliest breeders, and because of the size of the prey that they take, they start nesting early so that by the time they're young or of fledging age, there's kind of a flush of baby rabbits and baby squirrels and you know, birds are of the right size that they eat and so forth. They're taking advantage of the seasonality as well. So that's how they afford the luxury of nesting so early. But I wanted to point out the relationship between these two. If you want to find a great horned owl nest, I encourage you to look for red-tailed nests and check every great blue heron colony you see. Look for those ears sticking over the top of the nest. That's often the places that horned owls will take advantage of. Waterfowl are usually among the earliest arrivals in sort of a general way. Though all the wintering ducks, sea ducks and bay ducks and things, they begin to drift away quite early in the spring and really even in late winter, so that many of those are already gone, or the laggards now, the long-tailed ducks, they'll stick around right up until the third week or so of May. The same with brant, because these guys nest so far north that they have to wait until their Arctic breeding areas open up. But things like wood ducks and ringneck ducks, these are the vanguard of the waterfowl that we expect to see returning in the early spring. As soon as the ice goes out, a lot of the ponds are going to have ringneck ducks. They'll also have buffleheads, but a lot of the buffleheads have probably wintered on the coast and they're just moving inland to take advantage of the opening up fresh water. Wood ducks, on the other hand, most of those have probably wintered in the southeast. There are other lovely species of waterfowl in the spring, the early spring that follow. Northern pintails are one of the earliest of the puddle ducks to come in, along with green-winged teal. Hooded mergansers are another one that are very common about the same time that the ice goes out, same time that you're looking for ringneck ducks. You should be thinking about looking for hooded mergansers as well. The hoodies will stay to nest. The ringers will not. The pintail's a pretty rare breeding bird in Massachusetts. But these, again, are among the earlier birds that have wintered well to the south in numbers. And as soon as things begin to open up further north, they're on the move. Meanwhile, in fields and wetlands and things, there's activity. Killdeer, one of the earliest of the migrating shorebirds, but these are an upland shorebird species. So as soon as, you know, the snow melts off plowed fields and cornfields and things, you should be thinking about looking for killdeer. Woodcock, on the other hand, are a very curious bird, but they're one of our earliest migrants. They're almost up there with the vanguard of some of the ducks and things. And even in winters when there's still snow in the ground fairly late in spring, they come, and using that long bill, they probe into wet leaves and thickets and things, looking for earthworms and all. But if you go out in the evening on a mellow evening, even, you know, in March, And sometimes even late February, if it's really mellow and there's not a lot of snow, you'll begin to hear the nasal breeding calls of American woodcock. So these would be some of the early spring shorebirds, upland and coastal, that are around. These are the birds that are waking you up every morning now. If you're not a sound sleeper, I dare say that tomorrow, if you open the window or if you wake up, set your alarm, at first light or, an hour or two after. Unless you are a biospherian and are living in an environment where there are no trees at all, or if you're somebody who's living in a city, there's a pretty good chance you're going to be able to hear a tufted titmouse or a Carolina wren. These things are like alarm clocks where I live, and they start seemingly very early and continue up until about the last week or few days. They go all day long. These are very persistent singers, and they have a loud chanting song. If you don't know it, you can listen to them on some of the tapes or some of the websites and things, and you say, oh, I hear them all the time. I wondered what that was. The robin would also belong in that category. The dawn chorus of robins is certainly one of the things that most people that live in areas where there are trees around, even suburban neighborhoods and things, you're going to have robins singing. I put the fish crow on here, and some of you are probably thinking, what the heck is a fish crow? Well, we actually have 3 black corvids in Massachusetts. We have the fish crow, we have the American crow, and we have the common raven. And in many cases, they actually all 3 occur in varying abundance together. I happen to be in an unusual circumstance where I'm living now, where fish crow is almost the most common corvid, member of the corvid family. American crows, they're around, they're pretty common. And I have a raven that about 2 or 3 times a week cruises through, and I'll hear him croaking, or he'll be sitting on one of the buildings or whatever, and so forth and so on. So in the morning, the fish crows here, they're right up there with the titmice and the Carolina wrens as alarm clocks, and they have a very nasal call. And this is a more southern species that's really pushed its way north into New England the same way, in fact, that the titmouse, the cardinal, and the Carolina wren have done. So that now these birds are really very common in Massachusetts. But when I was a kid, the titmouse didn't even start nesting in Massachusetts until the 60s. The cardinal about the same. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with red-bellied woodpeckers. The first red-bellied woodpecker didn't start nesting in Massachusetts until 1973. Now they're all the way from Williamstown to Provincetown. They literally are from the Bay to the Berkshires in their distribution. Another southern species that for various reasons have expanded their range northward. Climate change is undoubtedly a factor, but I think it's bold to say that it's the exclusive reason. But the fish crow would sort of belong in that southerly group that's really taken over in many areas in Massachusetts. Now, the early spring breeders are starting to come along, sometime in late March, early April. These would be things like the eastern phoebe, pine warbler. Pine warblers, in some cases, actually overwinter in Massachusetts. They come to suet feeders occasionally. And there's quite a few of them in the pitch pine barrens down on the Cape and all in the winter. If you beat enough thickets, you'll probably find a few or whatever. And sometimes you'll actually see little flocks of them. But by now, they're singing in every grove of pitch pines down there and big white pines anywhere else. And phoebes are probably nesting under your porch lid if you've got a place where they can build a nest. And they give you a clue. They say their name, Phoebe, Phoebe. Then come the little brown songsters. These would be things like the chipping sparrows. They normally show up about the 2nd or 3rd week of April. They're all over the place with this sort of little dry mechanical chipping sound. Song sparrows are here year-round, but they're much more numerous during migration. And then in the summer, they're streaked underneath. The chippies are plain underneath, and they have that little rusty cap with a stripe over the eye and a little black line through it. But they're very common in suburban areas. If you've got bushes planted around the front of your house and the foundation and so forth, you probably have chipping sparrows somewhere close by as well. And now, increasingly, we're beginning to get the main thrust of songbird migrants. Things like the little blue-gray gnatcatcher on the left and the hermit thrush on the right. These are sort of among the earlier insectivores, birds that feed on insects, although hermit thrushes regularly will linger in small numbers in the winter here, and that they're switching their diet like robins. They're kissing cousins to robins. They're thrushes, so they can switch over and eat berries the same way that robins do. But they have a beautiful song. If you've never heard it, you should make an effort to get out. If you live down in southeastern Massachusetts, go to Miles Standish State Forest some evening about 7 o'clock on a still night, and you'll hear them and you'll say, oh man, that's like a symphony.
And just to plug, they're also very common at the Wildlands Trust preserves in Plymouth.
Absolutely. They're pretty common in Plymouth in many areas where there's a lot of pines and pine oak. That's what they like. Good PR injection there. Thank you. So the little ruby-crowned kinglet, a tiny little bird. These are among the real early insectivores. And the palm warbler is one of the first migrants that isn't around in the winter to speak of, and generally is one of the first ones that we really start seeing and thinking of, this is what I've been waiting for, the first of the warblers that are going to continue north, because they don't breed in Massachusetts. And the aerialists, the ones that feed on flying insects, the swallows, the tree swallows, barn swallows, bank swallows, rough-winged swallows, and the chimney swifts. Very strange birds indeed. They go all the way to South America for the winter, and then they come back, and as their name suggests, a great many of them over time have adapted to breeding and spending the night during migration roosting in chimneys. And in some chimneys, there can be dozens or hundreds or even thousands of them at certain times of the year. But curiously, they're not colonial breeders. So that for all the chimney swifts that you may see in late summer and early fall going into chimneys, that's not like those nested in that particular chimney, wherever that particular chimney is or was. But they tend to be more solitary in their breeding. And the question always comes, well, what did they do before there was chimneys? They nested in primarily hollow tree cavities or behind waterfalls, on steep ledges, that kind of thing. Very interesting birds, the chimney swift, one of my favorites. And the tree swallow, of course, is one that'll readily take to birdhouses. So for those of you who are trying to attract bluebirds, you kind of have to pick your sides, because tree swallows and bluebirds like the same kind of boxes in the same sort of locations, and they kind of compete with one another. So, and then they all have to compete with house sparrows. Tough world out there if you're a cavity nester these days, because a lot of cavities and things aren't as abundant as they once were. And finally, the birds that everybody is waiting for. That's why we have the birdathon this weekend, usually the second or third weekend in May. This is when the big flush of neotropical migrants often shows up. So things like the Blackburnian warbler and the black-throated blue warbler. There's about 30 some odd species of warblers that occur regularly in Massachusetts. Some of them nest, a lot of them don't. Most of them that do nest in central and western Massachusetts up in the hill country, but we have some like the common yellowthroat, the yellow warbler, the pine warbler, chestnut-sided warbler, redstart. These are all species that also nest, here even on the South Shore. And then, as I said, along the coast, there's things happening. The killdeer and the woodcock, which are more inland in the early spring, increasingly now, the coastal shorebirds are coming. The yellowlegs are usually one of the earlier species. Most of these are greater yellowlegs, and their numbers will building up, in the next week or two, and then they'll move on, because a lot of the shorebirds are going on up into the Arctic or subarctic for the summer. Little piping plover, on the other hand, he's here for the summer, and of course this is a federally threatened species, a federally listed species here on the Atlantic seaboard. And because of a lot of effort to protect them on the beaches and so forth, their populations are doing very well. But it requires constant vigilance to keep vehicles and people and dogs and so forth out of the areas where they're breeding, which are often very close to where least terns nest. So if you've got least terns nesting on a beach, you want to be looking for possibility of a piping plover pair somewhere nearby. But these guys are piping plovers. It turns out most of them winter in the Bahamas, but a lot of them go down into the Caribbean elsewhere or on the Gulf Coast and so forth. But here in Massachusetts, they're a summer species.
Hey Wayne, going back to warblers.
I'm sorry?
There's a question in the chat about warblers, the best places in Southeastern Mass to find them.
Well, unfortunately, the answer is not in Southeastern Massachusetts. In other words, the spring migration of many songbirds is a relatively often uneventful occurrence in Southeastern Massachusetts, other than the arrival of residents. And the reason is, if you just look at a map and think about where the main breeding grounds for a lot of the species that one goes to Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge to see in the spring, or Marblehead Neck Wildlife Sanctuary on the North Shore, or Parker River Refuge at Plum Island, those places are really on the highway to where they're ultimately bound. It's like the poor people out on the Cape. Cape is a wonderful place, or can be in the fall for birds, but in the spring, it's rough business. Unless you get a really strong southerly flow, places like the beech forest in Provincetown and some other areas on the outer Cape, sometimes will get modest numbers of migrants. But on the South Shore, it's not a big deal. Manomet, because of the fact that there's so much data from having been banded there for so many years, is obviously a spot that gets them. But unfortunately, that's a place where it's hard for people to go because it is a bird observatory and they're netting birds and so forth. Some of the big tracts of land, a lot of the Wildlands Trust properties are potentially good spots for them. Wampatuck State Park in Hingham is a popular spot. The Glades out in North Scituate can be a good spot in the spring. A lot of the outer beaches where there's thickets, if you can access them. See, the problem in many cases, some of the places that even within my lifetime were much better now are much more difficult to access because they've been privatized or they've been developed or altered in ways that are not favorable to a lot of the birds that people sort of think of as spring migrants. It's disappointing that it's not easier to go out and just find some of these colorful migrants in big numbers, the way I used to remember being able to do. I grew up in Wellesley, and Wellesley was a tremendous area for birds. We had lots of habitat, the migration was notable, and it was on that same superhighway that kind of hit the coast north of Boston in Essex County and on up to Plum Island. That's where the action is. If you go out into the Connecticut River Valley and the Housatonic Valley in central and western Massachusetts, those are good areas for migrants as well, because the birds are using as leading lines there the river, the Connecticut River, and the Housatonic as they come up from New York through Connecticut and so forth. But the South Shore, sadly, when I've been living on the South Shore since 1970, and it was kind of a rude awakening, and I gradually got the message. I see why now I don't see as many birds as I used to, because the habitat here and the geography just is not as favorable to where a lot of these birds are going and where they want to be. Indigo bunting and scarlet tanager, these are some of the birds that come later in the migration. From now on, we should be thinking about looking for these guys. And these are both fairly common nesting birds down here. But unlike some of the warblers and things that don't breed in this part of the state, they don't show up in the same numbers. So that kind of comes back to the question, where are good places to go? You have to be satisfied with fewer numbers in most cases, and you may have to do a little more looking to find them. There's places in Quincy that can be really, really good. And then sort of near the end are things like the cuckoos and some of these caterpillar specialist things that eat lots of caterpillars. Red-eyed vireos are usually just barely starting to arrive now, and their big numbers won't be in for another week or 10 days. And a lot of the cuckoos don't even arrive until June. They're waiting for the tent pat caterpillars and things to be available, because they're they're cuckoo caterpillar specialists, and they're stalking caterpillars, as it were. So again, it's really, as I've said right along, it's all about food and how they strategize to get it. So I guess the bottom line is that now that spring has arrived, or at least we'd like to think it has, especially since Birdathon is on Saturday, get out there and revel in the mystery of migration. Think about where some of these birds are coming from. Use your field guides to look at the maps and see where they're going to. Do some reading. There's some great books on migration and so forth and so on that I think would serve everybody on this chat well to read, and it might really surprise you what you don't know. Cornell Laboratory of Ornithology has all these wonderful workshops and things that you can take for practically nothing, and you might really up the ante in terms of some of the things that you find out about as you begin to investigate a little more. Again, special kudos, Brian Small, again, because so many of the beautiful songbird images were his, and a number of other photographers, too numerous to mention, gave me some of the other pictures. But I want to thank them. And I want to thank you again, Rachel, for giving me the opportunity to do this, and for all of you people who, if you're still awake or sitting in on this, for participating. And hopefully, I would suggest that some of you might want to think about exploring raising the, not raising rather, but I looked at that, raise your hand, joining the South Shore Bird Club. Go to our website and take a look, and we always welcome new participants on field trips and welcome you as members, and we do some programs from time to time as well. So that's another opportunity for people. Okay, questions?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Wayne. So yeah, we do have some questions. We have a raised hand from Mary. I'm going to go ahead and unmute you so you can ask.
Let's see,
can
I can open myself up now, right?
Yeah, actually you can go and hit at the top of your screen, stop sharing.
Stop sharing, okay.
There we go.
Yeah. And then I need to hit my little speaker, or the little four-sided thingy. Isn't
That's
there,
for,
I can see if there's a hand up?
Yeah.
I can see if there's a hand up. So I already called on Mary. Mary, I'm going to lower your
All right.
hand and
Okay.
get off mute. So go ahead, Mary.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I can. Yep.
Okay, good. I'm actually from Gardner, Mass, which is in way up towards the New Hampshire border in northern Worcester County. And my
My
question
lady
is,
friend lives in Phillipston, so I do know where it is.
oh, that's great. You may know then, do we have scarlet tanagers and the indigo buntings up in our neck of the woods, or are they mostly?
Yes. The answer is yes. You may have more tanagers, or tanagers may be actually easier to find than indigo buntings. Tanagers are really not a rare bird in forested areas. And if you learn their song, that's the key to finding them, because they have quite a loud song, but they're a canopy species. And even though they're bright red with black wings and tail, they can be hard to see in the canopy. But if you know their song, then you can track them down. And
Oh, great.
maybe get a look at them. Indigo buntings, if you have power lines, big power lines that run cross country,
Mm-hmm.
indigo buntings are edge specialists. So they love power line corridors because they're nothing but edge on either side. And depending upon the adjacent landscape, you'll often find them there. Sometimes even in the median strip of big highways, if they're heavily wooded, if there's a place where you can pull over, or sometimes even they sing extensively. And if you're driving along with the window open and you know what they sound like, you can often hear them singing just from driving on the highway. So the key thing is with indigos, if there's orchards, that kind of thing, but they kind of really like forest edges, and I use power lines as probably the best sort of thing to think about as a place to look for indigos. And they like shrubbery, underneath, not manicured, but with some shrubs.
And we do have power lines, so that's a great tip for me. And thank you so much for an awesome presentation.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for coming and attending, or whatever the operative word is.
I don't know what it's called
We're
anymore.
hanging in there. Maybe that's what I should say.
I'm going to go to a question in the chat here from earlier that I wanted to get to from Lois. Do winter bird feeders impact on migrating decisions?
Do winter bird feeders impact migrants? Well, I'll tell you, a lot of times at this time of the year, people who are creative, they will put things like oranges out, grapes, for things like orioles. Rose-breasted grosbeaks, when they first arrive, they will regularly go to, you know, a seed feeder. Some of the warblers will actually take advantage of suet if there's still suet available. If people, so the bottom line is, in terms of impact, they're not deal breakers for migrants in most cases, because remember that most people that are feeding birds are feeding seeds or grains of some sort, or suet or something like that, so that that kind of food isn't going to be attractive to a lot of the insect-eating birds, because their bills just can't manage it. Some of them can sort of do double duty, but it's things like suet, or the people that feed with mealworms, they're going to get some of the southern migrants as they come north. When I say southern, I mean they're long-distance migrants that have wintered in the south or the south of the border. But as far as any negative impacts, no.
Okay, great. We have another question from Michael. How has climate change caused migration to become out of phase somewhat with plants and insects?
Well, this is arguably the most difficult question of the evening, and it's in many ways one of the best questions, because there are lots of people that are looking at it from the perspective of how is it going to affect birds, or how is it affecting them. One of the things that is absolute, and again, I because I know a lot of my friends are at Manomet, and when I was younger, I used to work at Manomet and so forth. They've been monitoring this kind of thing over a long span of time, and it's unequivocal that there probably are at least half a dozen or more species whose average arrival is earlier by, in some cases, as many as multiple days than it was in the earlier years of Manomet. For those of you that don't know anything about Manomet, it was at its point of establishment a bird observatory, and it's located on Manomet Point, near Manomet Point. And they have been banding and studying birds there continuously since 1969. So they have a huge database of very carefully monitored study and so forth. So they have really been able to determine beyond a reasonable doubt that there are a suite of species that in fact are showing up earlier than they ever did before. Climate change is also manifesting itself in the way in which the Christmas bird counts at the other end of the year, they're conducted in late December. There's a lot of species that increasingly are lingering and wintering in Massachusetts that never did. And again, even within my lifetime, there's a lot of birds now that are regular in the wintertime that never were, or they were very scarce. And those numbers, again, are beginning to creep up, not only in terms of the number of different species for which that applies, but also the number of individuals in some cases. So the greater question and the greater mystery with climate change is that how the earlier season, so to speak, the earlier leaf out and so forth that we're seeing regularly every year, it seems, in these days. Again, I'll use Mount Auburn Cemetery as a good reference point, because I grew up in Wellesley as a kid, and from going forward, I would go to Mount Auburn all the time. And I can remember when a lot of the very trees were not in full leaf the way a lot of them now are by this date, or even a week ago. And that, again, is a function of the change in the seasonality and how it's affecting it. So if you think about insects, which are taking advantage of leaf out or the emergence of large numbers of caterpillars, things like winter moths, for example, these things that you see around your lights, you know, right up into early December. They lay their eggs. Those caterpillars emerge just about as the leaves are starting to come out, which is why in a lot of years, in recent years, we've had such early defoliation, because these caterpillars are coming out and they're literally eating the leaves before they have a chance to, you know, get fully leafed out. So many of these warblers and other birds are feeding on caterpillars that if their arrival is not in phase with when the maximum supply of food is available, that's going to have an impact. And going forward, it's hard to say what the bottom line is, but for the coastal species, with the combination of sea level rise associated with climate change and increasing water temperature, that's going to affect and is already having demonstrable effects on things that feed on small baitfish or are dependent on plankton in one way or another. And so I think the answer on the one hand is definitely there's an effect. And I think there's a real struggle to try to figure out exactly what the effects are currently and what they're going to be, you know, from an anticipatory point of view, in terms of how much resilience the existing species today have to these changes, and what can we as humans, since we're unfortunately a major element in bringing about the climate change, or the rate at which climate change is occurring, what are we going to do about it? How are we going to fix this? And of course, that's really what the real challenge is.
All right, it is 8:40, so we're gonna stay on. There are a few more questions in the chat, and I think Wayne, are you okay to stay on for a minute?
Hey, you're the best game in town.
Okay, but I do understand that some people need to tune out, so I just
No,
wanted
that's
to say,
fine. And as I say, I appreciate everybody's for sticking with it. If you did, and you get high marks from my.
There's still 63 people on right now, so that's
how many?
Pretty good. There's still 63 on right now.
63.
We had 88 at one point. So thank you all so much.
What was your what was the max that you had?
88.
88?
88, yeah.
Wow.
This is just great. It's proven to us that you want these programs, and we do have a few more coming up. Next Thursday, we just added to the series, so we're going to have Abigail Archer from the Woods Hole Sea Grant do her talk about the removal of the Holmes Dam in Plymouth on Town Brook and how that has affected the herring migration to Billington Sea. That was a talk that was scheduled for the end of March, and we canceled literally that morning when the governor announced the state of emergency. So we're going digital with that, and it's going to be great. Abby's a wonderful presenter. And as you know, these programs do fill, so if you want to join us live, please do register. And then the following week, we're going to have an afternoon program with Blake Dinius, who is our county entomologist for Plymouth County, and he's going to be talking about mosquitoes and ticks and how to protect yourself, which is a very important topic, and we're just trying out the afternoon time slot to see how that goes. It is filling, so if you're interested in participating, again, please register. And keep an eye on your inbox for a follow-up email from me that will include a survey for you to evaluate this program, and it will include a membership link, and it will also include the recording of tonight's program, which will be hopefully up on our website tomorrow. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Wayne. And if you want to stick around and ask more questions, and we'll get to the other questions in the chat, I welcome you to. And if you need to sign off, that's fine too.
Thank you, Rachel.
Yeah. All right, there's a question in the chat about, for migrants, when do they sleep?
That is a good question. Yeah. They literally will catnap, and it's typically during the daytime, because if they're nocturnal migrants, you know, they do come down before dawn, but sometimes they'll actually be moving at dawn, and there'll be some sort of reorientation flights that take place after dawn. So, you know, their options are somewhat limited. It's not like they go without sleep, because they do have to sleep and they have to rest, but they can catnap. I mean, occasionally I've been fortunate enough or lucky enough to actually see a bird go to sleep in a tree. you know, usually fairly high, and they're just sitting very quietly, and you know, they sort of just pack it in. I remember seeing a worm-eating warbler in Key West go to sleep right in front of me. It was about 20 feet in front of me on a branch, 2 or 3 feet off the ground. And I'm looking at this thing and I said, that thing's asleep. And I don't want to wake them up. So yeah, I mean, it's a good question, but they do get their sleep. Where they get into trouble is obviously if they are in circumstances where they can't land. This sometimes happens for migrants that are not by design accomplished enough to make long overwater flights. So if you're out on a boat, often in the fall, but in the spring as well, sometimes migrants will come aboard the boat and they'll obviously be very tired and they'll sort of hop around and so forth. And then sometimes they'll take off and make for land again. But yeah, it's interesting. And then while it doesn't particularly apply to what we're talking about here tonight, there are some species that apparently can sleep on the wing. There are some swifts that can fly seemingly 24/7 for long periods of time. There are some seabirds, things like sooty terns and noddies, frigate birds. These are birds that after nesting is over, they go to sea. I mean, they don't even come back to land. And the only way that since they can't land in the water, they get their food by dipping down and picking it off the surface. They have to be able to sustain flight. And it's probable that they do something in some way or another that's comparable to what dolphins do. Dolphins can put half their brain asleep, like most undergraduates in college. They have that ability to literally seemingly be awake, but not be in their entirety. And I think probably that ability to shut down one hemisphere or the other may be something that some birds can do and can still, you know, maintain themselves in flight.
I'm wondering if anybody wants to jump in and ask a question in person. I don't see any hands raised, but if you want to just take yourself off mute and ask a question now, that's fine. All right. The last question in the chat is, I lost it. Where did it go? Oh, do they hibernate? Do birds ever hibernate or partially hibernate?
That's a good question. And the answer is yes and yes. There is a species of bird. It's a nightjar. It's related to the whippoorwill. It's called the poorwill. It's a western, southwestern species that in fact has been demonstrated to actually hibernate. Now they literally do what true hibernators do. But it's one of the only birds in the world that has ever been established to do that. But hummingbirds, many hummingbirds, for example, they have the ability to go into torpor. There's lots of high elevation hummingbirds in the Andes in South America. I mean, these things are up at 10, 12, 14,000 feet. And it's so cold at night that what they do is they will just sit down on a little twig or a branch and they go into this torpor and they're practically dead. I mean, it feels like or it would appear that they're hibernating, but they're not. And by the next morning, as the sun comes up and begins to warm up, they start warming up their jets and eventually off they hum, they buzz away. So torpor is something that hummingbirds particularly are well known to do, and it's been carefully documented. But the poorwill is about the only bird that has really been demonstrated that I can think of that's ever been truly proven to hibernate in the sense that mammals can hibernate and so forth. It's an interesting thing that, you know, with 10,000 species, you'd think, well, there must be some others that can do it. And there may be, but if they're in hibernation, who's going to know unless you find one or they disappear for how many weeks or whatever, and where did they go?
We have a question from Joseph. How would a purple gallinule get to Yarmouth? I'm sure I didn't pronounce that right.
No, that's right.
Okay.
How would
How would
it,
it get to Yarmouth?
how?
Yes.
Purple gallinules are nuts. Purple gallinules are birds that if you look at them, they have shown up in some of the weirdest places on the planet, in some of the most remote islands and miles away from where they normally live. It's like they periodically just go ballistic and they start flying, and seemingly whenever the spirit moves them or they run out of gas, they land. And so vagrant purple gallinules are things that are not totally off the wall. I mean, there are purple gallinule records for almost every month in Massachusetts, and yet, you know, they don't nest here, they don't belong here, they don't regularly occur here, other than the fact that as vagrants, wanderers, they do. And there are lots of other places on the planet where purple gallinules have ended up, and nobody seems to know, why did this bird how did it get here? Because you don't think of them as strong flyers, and yet they often are capable of traveling long distances, it would appear, based on where they end up. So that's an interesting question. And the why is harder to answer than how. The how, they're able to get there somehow. I mean, they fly, but why they do it and what motivates them to take off out of, you know, from the areas where they normally live. There are birds that live in the Southeast, you know, in Florida and the southern states, Texas and things. They don't belong on Cape Cod, but there's a lot of records from Massachusetts. At all funny times of the year, they'll find them in snowbanks. There was a roadkill in Rockport a couple of winters ago. Things like this. I mean, just very, very strange. That's an interesting question.
That is funny. All right, that's all the questions in the chat. Nobody has a hand raised. Again, everybody can jump off mute at this point. If you'd like to say anything, you are welcome to. And thank you so much, Wayne.
Say goodnight to the
Hero
people.
here.
Thank you, Rachel, and thanks again, everybody. I'm going to leave the chat here, and I appreciate your participation, okay? Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you.